I want to read you a news item that came out this week and then explain why it tells a much bigger and frankly more embarrassing story than it appears on the surface. So I'm just going to read through the article. Bear with me to the end. I'll explain everything. And then, I've got a fair amount to say about it. Let's just say that. All right, here is the article. Saudi Arabia pressures Trump to scale back war on Iran. Saudi Arabia is pressing the United States to scale back its war in the Middle East, fearing Iran could retaliate by blockading the Red Sea and paralyzing the kingdom's economy. Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, wants Donald Trump to lift his naval quarantine, the blockade of Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf, and return to negotiations, Gulf diplomats say. The Saudi lobbying reflects concerns in Riyadh that Tehran would retaliate against the U.S. blockade by instructing the Houthi allies in Yemen to seal its Houthi allies in Yemen to seal the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a Red Sea choke point through which much of the kingdom's oil supplies pass. Okay, so this is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Here's Saudi Arabia. Okay, here's Saudi Arabia on the screen, right? This is Saudi Arabia. And the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is down here. And they're worried that with the Strait of Hormuz closed, they're worried that the Houthis are now going to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well. Okay. The abrupt shift by the Arab world's lone Iran hawk, first reported by the Wall Street Journal and confirmed to the Telegraph by two Gulf officials, has emerged amid growing regional anxiety about Mr. Trump's handling of the war. There's the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. While Gulf states had urged the U.S. president not to go to war, meaning the other Gulf states, Saudi Arabia was, in private at least, an exception. After last June's U.S. airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, the Crown Prince is said to have abandoned his previous restraint, concluding that Tehran would only grow stronger unless defeated on the battlefield. He reportedly joined forces with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, to seize what they cast as a historic opportunity to inflict a lasting defeat on Iran and reshape the Middle East, a view not shared by other Gulf states. Saudi Arabia's greater tolerance for risk was partly rooted in geography. Unlike its neighbors, it has two coastlines, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. After Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia rerouted much of its crude exports from Ras Tanura on the Gulf to the Red Sea port of Yanbu via its 750-mile east-west pipeline. In other words, the other Gulf states, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Emirates, right? They're all on the Straits of Hormuz they're much more dependent on the Straits of Hormuz than Saudi Arabia is, because Saudi Arabia, besides this coastline, also has the coastline on the Red Sea. And even though their oil fields are all mainly in this part of the country, right, all the way on the eastern side, that's where they mostly are, they built a pipeline that goes all the way across to Yanbu. Here's Yanbu right here. This is Yanbu. Okay, it's Yanbu. Okay, so they built a pipeline across to Yanbu, and they can get their oil out that way. More on that later. Exports are now close to their pre-war level of 7 million barrels a day, helping steady oil prices and shield the kingdom from the worst pain felt by the smaller neighbors. The economies of Qatar and Kuwait are forecast to shrink by 14% this year, while Saudi Arabia faces a painful but more manageable contraction of 3%. Yet that resilience could unravel if the Houthis, the Iran-backed militia controlling northern Yemen, resume attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea or attempt to control the Bab el-Mandeb. Okay, that's what they're worried about. So the Saudis are worried about the Houthis disrupting shipping, resuming their attacks on shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Even a single successful strike could deter ship owners from sending tankers to Yanbu, potentially triggering turmoil in global energy markets. Around 2/3 of Saudi crude exports are bound for Asian refineries under long-term contracts. Rerouting them north via the Suez Canal is largely impracticable. Supercarriers, specifically very large crude carriers, sit too deep in the water to transit fully laden, and alternatives could add up to 29 days to each journey. Let me explain this paragraph very easily, quickly. Okay, here's the way it works. So the Saudis have two ways to get oil out. Almost all the oil, 2/3 of the oil the Saudis produce goes out to the Arabian Sea, out towards Asia. Okay, so one way to get it out there is through the Straits of Hormuz, right? So that means that you put it here. It goes through the Straits of Hormuz. It comes out here to the Straits of Hormuz and out into the Arabian Sea. The other way is to send it through the pipeline to Yanbu, all the way across, and then the tankers fill up here, or here really, and they go down south through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and out to the Straits of Hormuz. Now, and then, as the article just said, moving the oil up through the Suez Canal and then out through the Mediterranean, and then around the bottom of Africa, and then out to the Arabian Sea, right? Moving it around this way is impractical because, number one, the Suez Canal is too shallow. The tankers can't travel through there full. And also it would add something like 29 days to go all the way around Africa to go back out to Asia, okay? So that's what that paragraph was about. We'll get into all of this in a few minutes. How serious the Houthi threat remains unclear. Iran has previously hinted it could activate its allies with a single signal. But as we've seen, the proxies haven't been that active in this war. Not all of them. The Hezbollah has been, Iraqi Hezbollah a little bit also, but the Houthis haven't done a whole lot. They've poked their heads out of their hole in the ground a little bit, but they haven't been that active. The Houthis have a history of such attacks. Between 2023 and last year, they carried out 190 attacks on commercial vessels, sinking 2 and capturing a third. Okay, sinking 2 and capturing a third. So that was their big success. But that's enough. That's enough to deter shipping. Red Sea traffic fell by more than 60%. Their firepower has since been degraded by hundreds of U.S. and British airstrikes on missile sites, with the Royal Navy escorting dozens of vessels through the strait under fire. Israeli strikes, meanwhile, eliminated much of the Houthi high command, including an attack last August that killed 12 senior figures, among them Ahmed al-Rahawi, the Houthi prime minister. Even so, some analysts believe the group retains the capability to mount a disruptive maritime campaign, but whether it would heed a request from Iran is uncertain, meaning it's not so clear the Houthis would even listen if the Iranians told them to start closing the straits of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, because they don't want to incur the wrath of the Americans. That is the view among remnants of the Southern Transitional Council, the STC. We're going to learn a lot more about them soon. A UAE-backed secessionist movement in southern Yemen. For more than a decade, the STC was seen as the most effective force countering the Houthis on the ground. They weren't just seen as, they really were the most effective force. But Saudi Arabia, backing a rival militia, forced the movement to dissolve in January after crippling it with airstrikes that halted an STC offensive in eastern Yemen. The decision left a strategic void that may be returning to haunt Riyadh. That is correct. The Saudis attacked a group that was fighting against the Houthis, even though the Saudis are also against the Houthis. We'll explain everything in a few minutes. Stay with me. Senior figures in the now largely underground movement, the STC, said that while they did not know if the Houthis were planning to resume attacks, they're almost certainly capable of doing so. The STC president, Amr al-Bid, his special representative, said, quote, "The conditions for a resumption of strikes on shipping," meaning by the Houthis, "are now more permissive than at any point since 2023. The ground force architecture that previously constrained their coastal operations has been removed. If the Houthis were to act, the ability to respond from inside Yemen simply does not exist the way it did." Whether the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who once preached moderation towards Iran in an effort to present the Middle East as a beacon of stability, now regrets his earlier hawkishness remains unclear. Across the region, the Gulf states' bet on Mr. Trump appears to be souring. Welcoming his return to the White House, they ramped up oil output, they pledged trillions of dollars in U.S. investment, they hosted him lavishly, and in Qatar's case, they even gave him a luxury Boeing 747 to replace Air Force One. Such largesse was meant to secure American protection and guarantee stability. Instead, some officials grumble, Mr. Trump has set the Middle East on fire. There will be no rupture. The Crown Prince will not admit to buyer's remorse in public, but Saudi Arabia's Iran policy is likely to pivot towards caution, officials say. The kingdom could absorb one blockade. It has balked at a second for fear it might trigger a third at a cost too high for even the mightiest petrostate of them all. Okay, that's the article. Now let me explain. Okay, so let's pull up the map. Let's leave that up here now because that will be much more helpful. Okay, let's leave the map up there and we'll explain what the heck is going on with this situation because it's nuts. Here we go. Okay, so Saudi Arabia has one of the most expensive American-equipped militaries on the planet, and it's lobbying Washington to back down, to de-escalate, and to negotiate, rather than doing something about the Houthi threat itself. Let me explain. Okay, here's the question I want to answer in this video. Why? If the Houthis are threatening to close a waterway that Saudi Arabia depends on for its economic survival, why doesn't the kingdom just do something about it with all that military equipment and capability they have? And the answer involves a decade of catastrophic strategic mistakes, a falling out with their closest ally, and a trap that the Saudis essentially set for themselves. Okay, let me walk you through the whole thing. First, you need to understand the physical geography because it's the foundation of everything else. Saudi Arabia's oil fields are in the east of the country. I mentioned that before, the eastern province, sitting on the Gulf. Now, normally tankers load up there and they head through the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, so they load up here and they head out. They load up in the south on the east coast of Saudi Arabia and they head out through the Straits of Hormuz. That is the usual route that they take. Okay, into the open ocean, right? And that takes them out to Asia. But Saudi Arabia also has a second route. That's a trans-peninsula pipeline that carries oil westward all the way across the Arabian desert to a port called Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. So tankers load up at Yanbu and they head south through the Red Sea exit to through this narrow strait. So Yanbu is out here, right there, right near Medina on the coast. So the pipeline carries the oil from the east all the way to Yanbu. The tankers load up and then they head south through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Okay, that's the other route for Saudi oil. Okay, and then they head out to Asia from there. The pipeline was built precisely as a backup, as a way of keeping oil flowing if the Strait of Hormuz was ever to be threatened or blocked, as it is now. But here's the problem. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is being disrupted by the current U.S. naval blockade as part of the broader confrontation with Iran. So Saudi Arabia has been forced to lean heavily on that backup route. They've ramped up the amount of oil going through that pipeline. Yanbu exports have surged from under 1 million before the war, under 1 million barrels a day, to around 4 million or even up to 7 million. I mean, they're ramping it up now, and this happened kind of overnight. And the only way out for those tankers is through Bab el-Mandeb southward, which is controlled on the Yemeni side by the Houthis, right? Because the Houthis control this part of Yemen. They control this coastal region down into here. Okay, so that puts the Saudis kind of at the mercy of the Houthis. Now, rerouting the oil around Africa by going out through the Suez Canal, out north through the Suez Canal, is not really an option, right? In other words, you might ask yourself, well, wait a second, why can't the tankers fill up here at Yanbu and head north, go through the Suez Canal, and then they could head out into the Mediterranean, go around Africa, right? Come around the bottom and head out to the Indian Ocean and head eastward that way. And you could avoid Bab el-Mandeb altogether because the oil is coming across and up. Why can't they do that? And the answer is that it's very impractical. Okay, for a couple of reasons, for two reasons really. So one of them is that hold on a second. One of them is that the tankers, it would take way too long, and the other thing is that the Suez Canal is too shallow for full tankers to pass through. So it's not really a workable solution. So bottom line is this: Saudi Arabia, through a combination of circumstance and American pressure, ended up in a position where this one hostile militia in Yemen, the Houthis, controls the tap on their own economy. And that militia, that hostile militia, happens to answer, at least partially or mostly, to Iran. And that's the trap. Now, let me explain how Saudi Arabia built this trap for itself. And this is where it's just such foolish policy. So let's go all the way back to 2015. The Houthis are this Shia movement. They sweep down from northern Yemen. They sweep southward, and they seize the capital city of Sana'a. Let's zoom in now on Yemen. Okay, so here's Yemen. Here is Sana'a. Okay, so the Houthis start up here, and they come down and they capture Sana'a, and then they're headed further south, and they're advancing on the port city of Aden, which is all the way down here at the bottom. Okay, so they're going to cut off, and they're going to control the entire mouth of the Red Sea and the entire Bab el-Mandeb Strait on all sides, and that would be incredibly strategic for the Houthis. And so the Saudis panic, and they get a coalition of Gulf states together, and they launch military strikes, a military intervention to push the Houthis back. Now, they had American planes, American bombs, American intelligence and logistics support. They had the backing of the internationally recognized official Yemeni government. They had overwhelming air superiority. And 7 years later, after a war that killed at least 377,000 people, most of them civilians, Yemeni civilians, it created one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes on earth. The Houthis still controlled Sana'a. It was a total failure. They still controlled the Red Sea coastline. They actually expanded their capabilities, drones, ballistic missiles, anti-ship weapons, which were largely supplied by Iran. Saudi Arabia eventually sued for peace in 2022, and the Houthis were not defeated. Okay? So all of this firepower, all of this weaponry, the Houthis were not defeated. They weren't weakened into irrelevance. They actually emerged from the war stronger. They were battle hardened. They now were a regional force to be reckoned with, and they showed their ability to strike targets deep inside Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So when people ask why the Saudis don't just fight, the answer is they tried for 7 years with American weapons, and they lost. Now, there's another dimension to this. Stay with me. It's going to get even more interesting. There's another dimension to this problem in Yemen. So to understand this situation, you need to understand that Yemen is not a two-sided conflict. It's not Houthis versus the recognized government. Okay, and it never was. There are essentially three main political military blocs, and they do not get along. First, you have the Houthis. That's this Shiite, Iranian-backed movement. We know about them. They control the North and the Red Sea coast. They're the primary threat to the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. Second, we have the recognized government, the internationally recognized government of Yemen. It has its main military component, which is a party called Islah. But here's the thing. These are who the Saudis back. They back the government and Islah. But they are a Sunni Islamist group. They're aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. That means they're aligned ideologically with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Turkey, those groups, okay, the more Islamist hardline groups. Now, that might sound weird to you because the Saudis are anti-Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia, but that's just another one of these contradictions of the Saudis. So bottom line, Saudi Arabia backs Islah, Sunni Islamist, and which is the actual recognized government in Yemen. Then there's a third group, and this is crucial, and it was mentioned in the article I read. This is the Southern Transitional Council, the STC. Now, the STC exists because they want to restore an independent South Yemen, which existed as a separate country until 1990. Let me explain this very quick. This is what Yemen looked like until 1990. Okay, it was two countries. There was the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen in the south, otherwise known as South Yemen, and the Yemen Arab Republic in the north. And the STC's goal is to reinstate that division. The Saudis are opposed to that because they view a separated Yemen as more of a threat than an Islamist Yemen that is unified and weak. Okay, they're worried about this, so they oppose the STC. Okay, and the STC are secular, they're nationalists, they're secular, they're explicitly anti-Islamist, and they were backed and built up by the UAE. The UAE. So the UAE is backing STC while the Saudis back the government. And critically, here's the critical part of the STC. The STC was by far, the most effective fighting force against the Houthis until the Saudis attacked them. And this is where the Saudi story gets completely self-defeating and so foolish, it's idiotic. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE generally in the world are allies. They're both members of the and even in Yemen, they're both members of the anti-Houthi coalition. But the problem is that they've been running conflicting foreign policies in Yemen. They're backing conflicting groups. The UAE does not share Saudi Arabia's preference for Islamist-aligned governments. The UAE actively opposes the Muslim Brotherhood. So the UAE built up the STC as its proxy. It wants a secular STC in there who are also capable, and they're also very effective at fighting the Houthis, and they're also effective at fighting Islah, who the UAE does not like because they're much more strident in their opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia resented this. The STC threatened the unified Yemen that they want. The STC's territory in the south that they were holding was also encroaching on areas that Saudi Arabia considered its own sphere of influence, particularly a region called Hadramaut, which borders Saudi Arabia and sits on most of Yemen's oil reserves. Okay, let me show that to you on the map. That is here. Okay, so in Yemen, there's this whole section here, which is roughly this area called Hadramaut. It's not going to be mentioned, it's not going to be listed on a map because it's a region, but this region of Yemen right here, which borders on Saudi Arabia, has a lot of oil there. The Saudis did not want that going independent, and that was being controlled by the STC. So what did the Saudis do? This is where things just get so foolish. In December of 2025 and January of this year, just a few months ago, Saudi Arabia launched military strikes against the STC. Okay, so here's Saudi Arabia just a few months before this war with Iran breaks out, launching very strong military strikes, brutal military strikes against the most effective anti-Houthi ground force in Yemen, because the STC was far more effective at fighting the Houthis than the official government army, Islah. So these strikes by Saudi Arabia against the STC a few months ago, they took away the STC's territory. They forced the movement basically to dissolve itself or go underground. And it basically, it pushed the UAE's influence out of the country. So Saudi Arabia was, that's what they were trying to do, but they prioritized their rivalry with the UAE over the strategic importance and the need to counter the Houthis. And the consequence is that the STC, as I quoted in that article, their own representative said that the ground force architecture that previously constrained the Houthis' coastal operations has been removed. Right? You took away the ones who were you took away the only effective force against the Houthis. If the Houthis were to attack the Red Sea shipping, the ability to respond from inside Yemen simply does not exist the way it did. End quote. That's what the guy said. And he's right. Saudi Arabia destroyed the goalkeeper and now is worried about the Houthis scoring and complaining, oh my gosh, the Houthis are going to score. You killed the goalie. Okay, so given all of this, given that the Bab el-Mandeb is now an existential problem for Saudi Arabia, and given that the Houthis are rattling their sabers, why won't Saudi Arabia just use that American-supplied military? So I believe that there's 4 reasons. Okay, so I believe the question I opened the video with, why are the Saudis not just doing something about the Houthis themselves? If they're so worried about the Houthis closing Bab el-Mandeb, you got all this weaponry, go ahead, fight them. So I believe there's 4 reasons. Number 1, They already know that it doesn't work. 7 years of war proved that the Houthis cannot be defeated by air power alone. And Saudi Arabia has no appetite. When I say no appetite, they have no appetite for the ground campaign that would actually be required. Number two, the Houthis can shoot back. This isn't a one-sided equation. The Houthis have demonstrated repeatedly that they can hit targets deep inside Saudi Arabia, oil facilities, airports, cities, whatever. Now, one of the reasons Saudi Arabia made peace in 2022 was that Houthi drone and missile strikes on Saudi infrastructure were becoming economically intolerable. So they don't want to reopen a war with the Houthis. Okay, so number one is that they tried this and failed. Number two, the Houthis have a lot of capabilities and they don't want to reawaken that. It's kind of the same as number one. Number three, the political optics are brutal. The Houthis have been very smart about framing their actions. All of this disrupting global shipping since 2023, they've been framing the whole thing as solidarity with the Palestinians, as resistance against the American and Israeli imperialism. And that framing has real resonance across the Arab and Muslim world. Saudi Arabia, which positions itself as guardian of Islamic interests, can't easily be seen leading a war against a group that has successfully wrapped itself in the Palestinian flag. The domestic and regional politics are very uncomfortable. Saudi Arabia's population is much more Islamist than their ruling classes. So number four, final reason why I believe they're not attacking the Houthis is that they've been outsourcing the problem for too long. When the Houthis started attacking Red Sea shipping in late 2023, it was the Americans and the British warships, as we mentioned in the article, that responded. Okay, it was you had this operation by the Royal Navy where they were escorting ships through the strait and they were striking Houthi launch sites. And then the Trump administration came in and they launched a major bombing campaign in 2025, hundreds of strikes over a couple months. It ended in a ceasefire in which the Houthis agreed to stop targeting American ships specifically. Not all ships, just American ships. The Houthis were not defeated by any stretch of the imagination. The campaign simply ran out of steam. So Saudi Arabia has been perfectly happy to let Washington absorb the costs of all these risks and deal with the Houthis. The problem is that the Americans don't have unlimited patience. And the current administration is more interested in a deal with Iran than in indefinite military commitment in the Red Sea. Okay. Now, before we go on, this is a good place to point out, to remind you that if you're not subscribed to all my content, please do so. Please go, make sure that you go to Israel 365 News YouTube channel and make sure that you're subscribed to that channel and that you're catching all the videos we put up there. There's a lot of phenomenal interviews that we do. And deep dive analytical pieces, some videos that are a bit similar to what's on this channel. I want to draw your specific attention in the playlist section on the Israel 365 News channel to a playlist called Israel, the Rise of a Regional Superpower, which is a 6-part series where I lay out the entire kind of architecture of how the Middle East looks in the post-October 7th world, with highlighting Israel's changing role regionally and even globally. Okay, so make sure that you got all that and that you're subscribed to everything so you don't miss anything. Especially for a video like this, it fits into all of that. Like, you really want to understand how the whole Middle East is kind of mapped out these days. Make sure that you are subscribed to Israel 365 News, and that way you're getting all of my content that's being uploaded on a regular basis. Now, let's go back to the news item that we started with, and let's put this whole thing together. Saudi Arabia is now lobbying the Trump administration to end the Hormuz blockade and return to negotiations with Iran. The reasoning is almost painfully transparent. If Washington backs down from its maximum pressure on Iran, maybe Tehran will tell the Houthis not to disrupt shipping in Bab el-Mandeb. But think about what that means. Saudi Arabia, which was privately pushing for a hard line on Iran as recently as a few months ago, which reportedly coordinated with Israel on the view that Tehran needed to be confronted, is now pleading for de-escalation because the alternative is that its oil stops moving. This is not really a negotiating position. It's a country that has maneuvered itself into a corner. it's maneuvered itself into a corner, eliminated its own best options, and is now hoping that American diplomacy will extract it from a crisis of its own making. They set a trap for themselves. Let me bring this all together. Saudi Arabia has one of the world's largest military budgets. Okay, it's equipped almost entirely with American hardware. It faces a threat from the Houthis, this Yemeni militia. And this threat is to close the waterway that the entire export economy, or a lot of it right now, depends on. And its response is to ask Washington to please negotiate more gently with Iran. Why? Because it fought the Houthis for 7 years and couldn't beat them, because direct confrontation would invite missile strikes from the Houthis on its own infrastructure, and they're afraid of that, because it destroyed the one effective ground force that could have protected the Straits, the STC, in order to win this rivalry with the UAE. And because it's grown so accustomed to outsourcing security to the United States that it's lost the strategic habit and will to defend its own vital interests. The Houthis haven't even closed the Strait yet. They simply threaten to. And that threat alone has been enough to send Riyadh running to Washington. That's the state of Saudi strategic power in 2026. Right? There's no lack of weapons. There's no lack of money. There's a failure of strategy, of will, and of judgment. And it's been compounded over an entire decade, one bad decision at a time. Thanks for watching.